with a Vision that recently had an arson there, organization that works with women most on the edges of society, most left out of these other systems. Women who do sex work to survive, women who have substance abuse issues, women who are homeless, providing healthcare and advocacy and actually organizing within those communities. And organizations like that very rarely get this, this support from these national organizations. And in fact, they over and over again hear these questions of what will you do with this money? Can we trust you? How do we know that we can trust you? And in fact, going back to my quote page, so Dion Haywood, Executive Director of Women with a Vision and one of the founders, said, whenever you deal with foundations, it's not about us or our community's needs. It's about what's in their president's head that day. And a lot of that money from those foundations ends up going to the West Coast anyway. And to end this sort of section of it, I just want to quote Jay-Z from his recent book, Decoded, where he says, to some degree, charity is a racket in a capitalist system, a way of our making our obligations to each other optional, and of keeping poor people feeling a sense of indebtedness to the rich, even if the rich spend every other day exploiting those same people. So, it's filtered down even to Jay-Z, this, how clearly it is that this current system doesn't work. And I think that when we look at the large movements that are happening in the world, whether we look at the Occupy movement, whether we look at the revolution in Egypt and through the Middle East, this is not really coming through nonprofits. It's not coming through NGOs, as they're called internationally, right? Non-governmental organizations. These NGOs were not responsible for this people's movement in Egypt that overthrew the government there. Of course, we don't know what's going to happen with that revolution. It's still ongoing, but I think what we can be sure is it really had nothing to do with Peace Corps volunteers. It had nothing to do with USAID. It had nothing to do with the vast majority of where this sort of funding and support is going to. I'm going to quote just one international person who talks about this, Tajuddin Abdul Rahim, who's the Secretary General of the Pan-African Movement. I think he's based in Nigeria. And he says, I am sure that many NGO workers really have come to Africa because they believe they're doing something good and right. However, it's also true that many are here because of their careers. Our misery is their job. Where will a disaster manager work if there are no more disasters? And I think that we see that again, that people's careers become tied up in this idea of this always existing. Again, going back to Insight Women of Color Against Violence, when they talked about these problems with the nonprofit industrial complex, they talked about these women working on issues of domestic violence, and they would be talking about their 10-year plan and their 20-year plan, and all their plans, it was always sort of assuming that the status quo will continue. And they said, why is nobody ever saying, what is our plan to make it so that there is no more domestic violence? Why is nobody's plan to say to make it that there's no more sexual abuse, right? The plan is always, how do we deal with this continuing problem that will always be there? And nobody's visioning, how do we create a world where these problems don't exist? And I think we see this over and over again in these people dealing with disaster. And I think Katrina is a clear demonstration of a disaster that it's not about the hurricane, right? It's about the levee failure, it's about the lack of infrastructure, it's about the response. And these disasters are always shaped by race, by class, and these contours, by gender, by age. These contours shape what this disaster looks like and what this recovery looks like. And if we're an organization that is not challenging these issues that really create the disaster, we're not challenging injustices along the lines of race, class, and these other contours that shape them, then we're just ensuring that there will continue to be these disasters again and again. And so the idea is, how do we address these fundamental issues that are causing these disasters? I just want to say, going from Hurricane Katrina to the earthquake in Haiti, out of the first 1,500 rebuilding contracts that the U.S. contracted out to Haiti, only 20 men went to organizations based in Haiti. And this is again something that we see again and again, that the people locally are not given that funding to rebuild. The top 25 organizations that got foundation funding for rebuilding post-Katrina, I think none of them were based on the Gulf Coast. It was, the Bush-Clinton Katrina Fund. It was Red Cross. There was a couple that were based in the South, but none based in the actual region of the top. I think the Baton Rouge Area Foundation might have been on that top 25, so there might have been that one. So I want to shift from that into talking a little bit about media as well, and hopefully draw some parallels between these things. First of all, I think people talk about mainstream media, and I think that framing is not the best way to look at it. People talk about mainstream versus alternative media. And I think more than that, we should talk about corporate media versus non-corporate media. Because if you look at something like Al Jazeera, which Wade mentioned earlier, we have tens of millions of people around the world watching it. If you look at even Democracy Now! In the US, there's a huge audience that's watching it. It's not about whether that audience is mainstream or not, but I think it's about the source of funding and where that funding comes from. And when you have media that's funded by corporate dollars, it's accountable to those corporations. And I think, if you look at Democracy Now!, again, it's not a perfect model, but they're funded by listeners. I think it opens up a lot more what they can do. If you look at Al Jazeera, it's funded by a state, which is in some ways problematic, and people certainly have made critiques of why exactly it's problematic. But I think it's problematic in a different way. I'm not going to say better or worse, but in a different way than the way in which corporate media is problematic.
Who funds it?
The state of Qatar. So I think you certainly on Al Jazeera will not really see really critical coverage of the Emir of Qatar. But fortunately, I think you're not really seeing that anywhere because nobody really cares about the Emir of Qatar. But I think, there's critiques that, there's critiques of how much.
Should we?
Maybe we should. So I'm not going to support the Emir of Qatar really. But there's critiques like is Qatar's foreign policy agenda going to seep into Al Jazeera? There's people arguing about whether or not that's true. And I think, with some of the other examples that we have are RT, which is Russian TV funded by the Russian government. You have Telesur, which is a 24-hour news channel funded by Venezuela. You have Press TV, which is a 24-hour English language news channel funded by Iran. And I think on all of those channels, you can actually see really great coverage of issues in the US, right? Because all of them have as part of their agenda, they do, I think also they have good journalists working for them, and they're really interested in uncovering injustices in the US. I think all of them, in various regions, you can find a lot of weaknesses in what they have. Again, that's area for debate, but I think it's a different kind of weakness than what we see with corporate media, and I think that difference is really interesting and worth exploring. So I was in Egypt a few months after the uprising there, and spoke to some activists there, and some of their comments on what brought about that revolution was interesting. Again, they talked about how it wasn't from these NGOs, these non-governmental organizations. And also they really discounted this idea that it was because of Facebook or Twitter or whatever. And so an activist named Rabat al-Mahdi said one of the key elements that was important in the revolution was soccer hooligans. She said they were really key in the protest. She said, number one, they could light a car on fire in 3 seconds, which is incredibly important. And she said also that they could tell spies and provocateurs really well, that they found that was incredibly important, as there were attempts by the police agencies to put spies and provocateurs in significance. They could tell them they were very helpful with that sort of internal security in the movement. They also, Rabat also said that unions were very important in that, and when unions started to get involved in the revolution, that was a really important turning point. And she and pretty much everyone else I spoke to stressed really that Tunisia was important. And the uprising that just happened in Tunisia was huge. And I think, with Tunisia, with Egypt, with Occupy, all of these things I think are important for this example of saying that we are not at the end of history, right? That we haven't reached the end of change, that change is still possible, that in this country where it seems like no change is possible, whether we're talking about Egypt or Tunisia or the US, that this change is possible, this movement is possible, and that it can come up through a mass of people, right? So the second thing is that it's allied to this great man theory of history. This idea that JFK or Martin Luther King is responsible for the civil rights movement, and instead presents this idea of a mass of people, which is the way change actually happens. Another activist and blogger that I spoke to was Hossam Al-Hamlawi. And he stressed that the vast majority of protesters that were out there were people that didn't have internet access, right? So to credit Facebook for this revolution is ultimately really inaccurate. And he said one thing that was interesting is there was this idea that Facebook was this organizing base. And so people from these movement organizations would post a protest on Facebook. And then newspapers would be like, oh, this is a big story. And then the newspapers would print that, people are organizing this on Facebook. And then all these people would come out and people would credit Facebook with the organizing when actually really the vast majority of people had actually read about it in the newspaper, which was reporting what was on Facebook, right? So, it becomes about what got the credit. And he also said that in addition to Tunisia and these other things that they said Al Jazeera was really important in that moment too, and people watching Al Jazeera were really key. I think that we're in this moment in the U.S. especially of this collapse of media as what we needed to be, as journalism, as investigating, as holding the powerful accountable. And I think that people point to this huge outbreak of news and information that's available online, and that's true. Unfortunately, I do think that so much of what's online, aside from kitten videos, is really people commenting on other pieces. And there's still a huge lack, I think, of people doing original investigating. There's a real lack of funding and support for those kind of original investigations. I think that we also have these institutions that do media that are fundamentally unequal. And I think if we talk about these daily papers in the U.S., I think it's instructive to compare them to the New Orleans Police Department, or almost any police department in the U.S. or especially in the South. So the New Orleans Police Department was, through most of its history, an explicitly white supremacist organization. There were certainly no black people allowed in the New Orleans Police Department before. I'm not sure if I wrote down the exact year, but I think it was in the 60s. They had their first black officer, and not large numbers until the 70s. Now we have a New Orleans Police Department that, aside from our current police chief, for the last several police chiefs, that has had African Americans at the very top of the department, and certainly African Americans in leadership positions throughout the department. And yet we saw this police chief, this police system, this system of policing that is fundamentally racist, that is fundamentally unjust towards African Americans in this community, that on any sort of scale of judging how police are acting in different communities, you can see that this department is still racist. So you can see that changing those figures that are at the top is not enough to systematically change the institution. You really need to look at where systemic change is going to come from. And that's, I think, the hope in the current Justice Department investigations, the New Orleans Police Department, is this coming of systemic change to the department. Now, most newspapers also had no people of color up and through the 60s. And